Hi friends, how are you today? I bet you're wondering why I am sitting in your playhouse. Well, we came up I wanted to finish our book that we're reading together, Seed Folks, and it's raining. It's raining. So I thought, why not? We'll still do it here, and I hope you can hear the rain. It sounds so nice. I also hope you're all home and cozy. And if you remember, we were going to start on the chapter Virgil. It was, do you remember, how everybody was coming together to build the garden in that vacant lot? But then how all of a sudden they were putting keep out signs, no trespassing, and the garden was looking more not like paradise, but more like turning back into Cleveland. So are you all ready? I'm going to try to read the rest of the book in one sitting today, so get comfortable. And here we go. Virgil. My father, he always has a smile on his face and a plan moving in his head. We were standing together on the sidewalk while the men were cleaning the lot. I was watching the rats running for their lives. They were shooting off every which way. A couple of dealers came over, the ones always bragging about how bad they are. A rat ran right up one of their legs and the dude screamed, just like a woman does when you see a mouse in a cartoon, only louder. He shook his leg like his toe was being electrocuted, and that rat flew off and dove down a storm drain. I looked at my father, and that's when I saw that he hadn't paid the rat any mind, hadn't even turned his head. His eyes were stuck completely on the ground, on the garden land being uncovered. He had a 2-foot wide smile on his face. My father drove a bus in Haiti. Here, he drives a taxi. That night, he drove himself way across town to borrow 2 shovels from a friend of his. The next morning was the first day without school. I was done with 5th grade forever. I planned on sleeping till noon to celebrate, but when it was still half dark out, my father shook my shoulder. School was over, but that garden was just starting. We walked down and picked out a place to dig up. The ground was packed so hard. The tip of my shovel bounced off of it like a pogo stick. We tried 3 spots till we found one we liked. Then we walked back and forth, picking out broken glass, like chickens pecking seeds. After that, we turned the soil. We were always digging up more trash. Bolts and screws and pieces of brick. That's how I found the locket. It was shaped like a heart and covered with rust with a broken chain. I got it open. Inside was this tiny photo of a little girl. She was white with a sad-looking face. She had on this hat with flowers on it. I don't know why I kept it instead of tossing it in our trash pile. It seemed like hours and hours before we had the ground finished. We rested a while. Then my father asked if I was ready. I thought he meant ready to plant our seeds, but instead we turned another square of ground, then another after that, then 3 more after that. My father hadn't been smiling to himself about some little garden. He was thinking of a farm to make money. I'd seen a package of seeds for pole beans and hoped that's what we'd grow. They get so tall, and that man in the picture was picking them way at the top of the ladder. But my father said no. He was always asking people in his cab about how to get rich. One of them told him that fancy restaurants paid lots of money for this baby lettuce, smaller than the regular kind, to use in rich folks' salads. The fresher it was, the higher the price. My father planned to pick it and then race it right over in his cab, running red lights if he had to. Lettuce seeds are smaller than sand. I felt embarrassed planting so much ground. No one else's garden was a quarter the size of ours. Suddenly I saw Miss Fleck. I I hardly recognized her in her jeans. She was the strictest teacher in Ohio. I had her for 3rd grade. She pronounced every letter and every word and expected you to talk the same way. She was tall and even blacker than my father. No slouching in your seats in her class or any kind of rudeness. The other teachers seemed afraid of her too. She walked over just when we finished planting. "Well, Virgil," she said, "you seem to have claimed quite a large plantation here." That's just what I was afraid of hearing. I looked away from her, down at our sticks. We put them in the ground and run string around them, cutting our land into 6 pieces. I didn't know why till my father stepped forward. "Actually, madam, only this very first area here is ours," he said. He had on his biggest smile. He must have remembered her. "The others we have planted at the request of relatives who have no tools and who live too far." "Really now," said Miss Fleck. "Yes, madam," said my father. He pointed at the closest squares of land. "My brother Antoine? My auntie Marie? My eyes opened wide. They both lived in Haiti. I stared at my father, but he just kept smiling. His fingers pointed farther to the left. My uncle Felipe, he lived in New York. My wife's father, my mother didn't have any brothers or sisters. I looked at my father's smiling face, and I never had watched an adult lie before. "And what did your extended family of gardeners ask you to plant?" said Miss Fleck. "Lettuce. All lettuce." "What a coincidence," she said back. She just stood, then walked over to her own garden. I'm pretty sure she didn't believe him, but what principal could she send him to? That lettuce was like having a new baby in the family, and I was like its mother. I watered in the morning, and if my father was still out driving, it was supposed to come up in 7 days, but it didn't. My father couldn't figure out why, and neither of us knew anything about plants. This wrinkled old man in a straw hat tried to show me something when I poured out the water. He spoke some language, but it sure wasn't English. I didn't get what he was babbling about till the lettuce finally came up in wavy lines and bunches instead of straight rows. We'd washed the seeds out of their places. The minute it came up, it started to wilt. It was like baby always crying for its milk. I got sick of hauling bottles of water in our shopping cart like I was some old lady. Then the heat came. The leaves shriveled up. Some turned yellow. That lettuce was dying. My father practically cried, looking at it. He stopped by his cab when he could, with 2 5-gallon water containers riding in the back instead of passengers. Then bugs started eating big holes in the plant. I couldn't see anyone buying them from us. My father had promised we'd make enough money to buy me an 18-speed bike. I was counting on it. I already told all my friends. My father asked all his passengers what to do. His cab was like a library for him. Finally, one of them told him that spring or fall was the time to grow lettuce, that the summer was way too hot for it. My father wasn't smiling when he told us. I couldn't believe it. I stomped inside. I could feel that 18 speed slipping away. I was used to seeing kids lying and making mistakes, but not grown-ups. I was mad at my father. Then I sort of felt sorry for him. That night I pulled out the locket and I opened it up and looked at the picture. We'd studied Greek myths in school that year. In our book, the goddess of crops and earth had a sad mouth and flowers around her, just like the little girl in the locket. I scraped off the rust with our dish scrubber and shined up that locket as bright as I could get it. Then I opened it up just a crack. Then I whispered, "Save our lettuce," to the girl. I think her name is Sae Young. I'm not sure. It's S-A-E, but I'm going to say Sae. Always many people in my house when I was young. 5 sisters, many friends, always liked being with people. Then I leave Korea with my husband to come to America for work. We buy dry cleaning shop, live next block. Dry cleaning shop better than restaurant. Don't have to speak English too much and only work 6 days. We work together, 7 until 7. At night, I sew alterations. We save all for children's college so that they can have an easier life. But no children come. Very many years, we hope, but still alone. Then my husband died. Heart attack. 37 years old. Now all alone, except for friends. I hire a woman to work in shop. One afternoon when she was gone, a man walked into shop with coat to clean. Under coat, he has a gun. He take out money, then push me down. He yelling at me, very bad words. Then he kick me. Break cheekbone. Then he kick me again. Head hit hard against wall, and I go to sleep. When I wake up, I no more like to be with people like before, afraid of everyone all the time. I don't leave apartment for 2 months. Neighbor buys food for me at store. I don't open door if someone knocks, even friends, only for food. Afraid to walk on sidewalk with people. I hire Korean man to run cleaning shop. I never go in. That happened 2 years ago. Very slowly I get better. I go to store and buy my food, but very fast. Then not so fast. Very lonely, but still afraid. Then I pass by garden. Vietnamese girl was working there picking beautiful lima beans. A man on the woman on the other side, walking and talking over row of corn. Hear man say his wife give him hoe for birthday. I want to be with people again. Next day I go back and dig small garden. Nobody talked to me that day. But just be near people, nice people, feel good. Like next to fire in winter. Very hot and humid in July. Most people come early in the evening after work when air is cool. People watering and pulling weeds. Even if don't talk to anyone, sound of people working almost like conversation all around. People visit friends. I listen to voices. I feel very safe. Then man walk over and ask about peppers. I grow hot peppers, like in Korea. First time that someone talked to me, I was so glad. Have trouble talking. The man's name, Sam. He's American man and talk to everyone. Very smart. When people all the time complain about carrying water, he start contests. He say how adults couldn't solve problem. Let children try. He say he give $20 to child under 12 who has the best idea. He write this on paper and nail paper to post close to sidewalk. 1 week to contest. Kids out of school walk around, see paper, tell friends. On Saturday, everyone brings plans. Sam has wooden box. Lets each one stand on it and tell idea. One girl live in apartment by garden. She say she'll open window. People give her containers. She'll fill them and water. Then mother interrupts, say water bill too much. Boys say use water from fire hydrant. Another say run hose from Lake Erie. Many ideas. Sam explain how much money each one cost. Then little black girl say to let rain from sprouts go into garbage cans. Everyone look. 3 different spouts on walls of building around garden. Just have to take the bottom part of spout. Sam give girl $20. Everyone clap. Other people give money to buy garbage cans. Next day, thunderstorm. Cans almost full. Little girl there, very proud. Someone bring 3 old pots to scoop water out of the cans. Hard to pour into narrow containers. I quick go to store, buy 3 funnels to make much easier filling containers. I put 1 by each garbage can. That day I see man use my funnel, then woman, then many people, and feel very glad inside. Feel part of the garden, almost like family. Curtis. Deltoids, awesome. Pecs, check them out. Quads, now playing on a body near you. Can't help being born with this body or living 3 doors down from Cap's gym. Can't stop people calling me Atlas. Can't stop people calling me Atlas. That's short for Biceps Are Us. Actually, I started that name, but that was before Letitia cut me loose. We had a real nice thing going. She was a few years older than me, always talking about having a family, living in a house in the country like her aunt's place in Michigan. I wasn't really listening too hard. I was 23. With this body, I had other girls hanging on me at the time. Some of them I just couldn't brush off. When Letitia found out, she slammed the door in my face so hard the paint cracked. You don't know what you got till it's gone. All that was 5 years ago. It's caught up with her now, done fooling around. She was looking for a husband, and now I'm looking for a wife. I moved back from Cincinnati in May and ran into her brother that first day. Said she's still single, same 3rd floor apartment, but when I came up to her on the street, she turned her back. Wouldn't let me explain. Twice it happened. No chance for words, so I decided to give her some deeds instead. She lives straight across the street from the garden. I staked at a spot right by the sidewalk where she could look down and see it. Then I came home with 6 little tomato plants in plastic containers. She had a serious thing for tomatoes. She'd put a monster slice on a piece of bread and called it a sandwich. Then she'd even bite into it just like an apple. Always talking about eating them out of her aunt's garden when she was a kid and how she wanted to grow them someday. She probably thought I'd forgotten all about that. I planted them right there in front of her eyes to show her I hadn't, that I was waiting for her. I got the biggest beefsteak tomatoes. I could see them in my mind, bright as traffic lights, flashing at her across the street. I'd never grown anything before. I got into it. Every day something new. The first flower buds, then those first little yellow flowers, and then the tomatoes growing right behind them. This old man with no teeth and a straw hat showed me how to tie the plants up to stakes. Then someone else told me all their diseases. That got me worrying. What if all my plants started wilting or caught blight and died? That wasn't any message I wanted her to see. I started coming straight from work to check them. I noticed every little hole in every little leaf. I picked off the bugs, I pulled out weeds, and I gave them lots of that fertilizer called tomato food, like somebody had told me. From the little green marbles, those tomatoes started growing, and when they started getting orange, and then they went to red. I kept looking up at Letitia's window, wanting her to see it too. The only faces looking back were the drunks that hang out under her place. That liquor store's all boarded up, but they still suck on their bottles there anyway. They like to call me field slave and sharecropper and ask how Massa's crops is doing. I could have banged their heads together and shut them up, but I didn't. That was the part of the point of the tomatoes. I was showing Letitia that just 'cause I got some muscles don't mean I'm a jungle beast. I stopped working out and stopped going out with no shirt, no matter how hot it was. When some chicks would be walking by and see me there and say, "Looking fine," I knew what they meant, but I'd point to my biggest tomato and say back, "Sure is." My homies all laughed to see me out there, started calling me Tomato. I just smiled. Those tomatoes got big as billiard balls. One day, I checked them. My biggest one The one I'd been watching closest was gone. The next day, another one gone. It wasn't insects that took them. I was mad. They weren't even all the way ripe yet. My plants were right there by the sidewalk. I put chicken wire around them and even on top, but people could still reach in if they tried. I couldn't guard them every day and night. Then Royce showed up just in time. You drop bread on the ground and birds come out of nowhere. Same with that garden. People just appeared. People you didn't even know were there. Royce was like that, except that he didn't want nobody knowing he was there. One of the gardeners saw that her pile of grass clippings was all spread out. Had a sort of human print in it. He'd been sleeping there nights and leaving early. One morning he slept late. I'm the one who found him. He was 15, black, built big, looked like I did. His face was banged up. Said his father did it and threw him out. He didn't want to go back. I brought him breakfast and we made us a deal. I found him a place closer to my tomatoes, but hidden by somebody's corn, so the cops wouldn't see him sacked out. I bought him a brand new sleeping bag and I gave him money for food that week. Then I picked up a pitchfork for $3 at a junk shop. His part of the deal was that if he saw or heard anyone mess with my tomatoes, he'd come at him full speed holding the pitchfork. That was my best shot protecting him at night. For daytime when Royce was gone, I painted a sign that said Letitia's Tomatoes. It was big. I put it right there in front of the plants facing the sidewalk. If people know something belongs to a person instead of the city or the U.S. government, they're more likely to leave it be. When I pounded it in, I filled up my watering can. Walking back, I looked up at her window, as still as a cat. Behind that lace curtain, there was her face, staring down at the sign. You know what? I think we will finish. So it's Nora. I always try to get Mr. Miles out for a walk and a taste of fresh air. I don't know about his other nurses. I expect it's because I'm British. Back in England, you see, mothers pushing infants in prams through winter gales. I expect as well it was the sight of my own father, vegetating in his chair by the fire. We mustn't stop living before our time. So I'm forever telling Mr. Miles. It was midsummer morning and I was pushing his wheelchair up Gibb Street, a new route for us. The view, I'll admit, is less than uplifting. Half the storefronts seem to be empty. Mr. Miles must remember a very different scene. His landlady says he lived here many years ago. As he lost his speech with his second stroke, he can't tell me himself. He's a mystery. Lately, his interest in the world has declined. I stopped before a store window to let him see himself. He has the dignified head of an African chief, only to find that he'd fallen asleep. I realized that his time might be near, and then that morning, rolling along the sidewalk, suddenly his arm came up. He wanted to stop. I obliged him at once. To our left was a lot in which a few bold pioneers had planted gardens. We remained several minutes watching two Asian women hoeing, then continued on. Immediately, back up went his arm. I came around and looked at him. He twisted and pointed to the garden. I turned the wheelchair and headed back. I could see his nostrils were taking in the smell of the soil. We reached the lot, and his arm commanded me to enter. Over the narrow, bumpy path we went, his nose and eyes working. Some remembered scent was pulling him. He was a salmon traveling upstream through his past. That first day, we simply watched others. We might have been strolling through a miniature city. Some plots sported brick pathways and flower borders, while others looked haphazard. One had a gate that was, in fact, a car door. Within, beams climbed, a propped-up set of bed springs, a hummingbird feeder, a barbecue grill, a gardening hat hanging from a nail. There were many such domestic touches. I was entranced. I determined that Mr. Miles should do more than simply watch, wheelchair or no. I worked on the problem in my head, and 2 days later, driving to his apartment, I stopped at the garden and unloaded a large plastic trash barrel and a shovel. I wheeled him up an hour later, used my pocket knife to cut holes in the bottom of the barrel for drainage, and built up a fine sweat shoveling in dirt. I brought with me a dozen seed packets. Mr. Miles chose the flowers decisively, ignoring the vegetables. Was he recalling his mother's flower garden? His history was unknowable. I pushed him as close to the barrel as I could. 30 minutes later, he planted hollyhocks, poppies, and snapdragons. Riding home afterward, he smelled the dirt on his fingers with satisfaction. The small circle of earth became a second home to both of us. Gardening boring? Never. It has suspense, tragedy, startling developments, a soap opera growing out of the ground. I forgot the expectation produced by a tiny forest of sprouts. What a marvelous sight to behold. Mr. Miles' furrowed black face inspecting his smooth skin, young, just arrived in the world he'd shortly leave. His eyes gained back some of their life. He weeded and watered with great concentration. A fact bubbled up from his memory that the ancient Egyptians prescribed walking through a garden as a cure for the mad. It was a mind-altering drug we took daily. We were rather alone there, off to one side. Our most common visitors were the cats. They were attracted by the aroma of the fish, the work of a child who copied the pilgrims of old and buried sardines with her seeds. Then our solitary status ended as a result of a downpour. When the rain came that day, the other gardeners all ran in the same direction, as if in a fire drill. We followed them and found them sheltered beneath a shoe store's overhang 2 doors down, apparently their customary refuge. The small, dry space forced us together. In 15 minutes, we met them all and soon knew the whole band of regulars. Most were old. Many grew plants from their native lands, huge Chinese melons, ginger, cilantro, a green that the Jamaicans called kalulo, I don't know how to say that word, and many more. Pantomime was often required to get over language barriers, yet we were still all subject to the same weather and pests, the same neighborhood, and the same parental emotions toward our plants. If we happened to miss 2 or 3 days, people stopped by on our return to ask about Mr. Miles' health. We, like our seeds, were now planted in the garden. I told this all to out-of-town guests, then took them up to Terminal Tower. We got off at the observation deck on the 42nd floor to find that the garden, which looms so large to its tenders, was hopelessly hidden from view by buildings. I looked at all the tourists who'd no notion it existed, who thought they were seeing all of Cleveland, and restrained myself from pointing and shouted out, "The Gibb Street Garden is there." I think, friends, this might be our last paragraph. I think it is. Marciela. If you're Mexican, the Cubans and Puerto Ricans hate you because they think you snuck in illegally and they didn't, which they would have if they could have walked. If you're a teenager, the whole world hates you. If you're a pregnant teenager, people think you should be burned at the stake. I'm a Mexican, pregnant 16-year-old, so shoot me and get it over with. I wouldn't actually care if you did. In a way, I'm already dead. I used to be really hot. Because of the baby, I'm fat as a wrestler. I dropped out. I've been to exactly 0 parties, and I've been asked out exactly 0 times, including by the scum who got me pregnant. My parents were mad. They wanted me to graduate, but abortion or adoption, forget it. Then they sort of got excited about it, and they both love little babies, but not me. They started praying for it every night while it was begging my body to miscarry. 3 of us home from high school got into this program for pregnant teens. They give you rides to the doctor and help getting your GED at home. Great, except that Penny, the woman we see, saw the community garden and got the program in its own spot to give us practice taking care of something and to let us witness the miracle of life and to try to keep us from eating our babies alive or dropping them into dumpsters. It was already the middle of summer, so she had us plant radishes since they grow fast. All 3 of us hate radishes. As soon as this little green leaves came up, a gopher or something wiped them out. So much for the miracle of life. I didn't tell Penny I was hoping the same thing happened to my baby. We only have a few pages left, friends. She's so cheerful, I never could. She's not puking or getting as big as a blimp. No wonder she's always smiling. After the radishes came squash, then Swiss chard, which nobody knew how to eat. I was in my 7th month. I hated this bending. We all complained, but Penny just smiled. The rest of us called working there the chain gang. I hated the feel of dirt under my nails. One afternoon, Yolanda broke 2 of her fancy painted expensive nails and cursed out loud for 10 minutes. Penny couldn't shut her up. Then another woman came over and gave us this long lecture about the word decorum. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was my old 3rd grade teacher, Miss Fleck. I prayed she wouldn't recognize me, but naturally she did, and asked me all the usual questions. I should have had the answers printed up on a card to hand out. The next weeks, when some man threw a can at his window, which landed about a foot from my head, Miss Flick figured out what apartment he was in, walked up, and yelled at him like he was a kid. She treated the whole world like it was her classroom. Different people came to our part of the garden for different reasons. This Puerto Rican kid had 3 pumpkin plants that kept getting into ours, which gave him an excuse to walk right past me and talk to Dolores, who was 15 and pretty and still didn't look pregnant. I couldn't wait for her to get huge. Sometimes this black guy ran through our garden. He couldn't take time to go around. He grew lettuce, or tried to. Most of it was dead. He'd drive up in the cab, slam on the brakes like the Pope just stepped in front of him, run through our squash, cut a bunch of lettuce, and run back with it in a bucket of water. Then he'd peel out, leaving lots of rubber. Then there were people who came by to give us different things, vegetables that they'd grown and thought we should eat, which we always gave away later, advice on growing our own stupid Swiss chard, advice on giving birth and raising kids, which I tuned out as soon as they started. One day in August, it was just me and Penny. This black woman, Leona, who had a garden and talked to us, came over and gave me some flowers she'd grown. They were yellow. She called them goldenrod and she said if I made them into tea, it would help with the delivery. She knew I didn't want to be pregnant. I could talk to her about it. That day it was almost too human to talk. The windows around the garden were open and you could hear 10 different TVs and radios. A storm was coming. The thunder was getting closer and then it hit bam! Then all the TVs and radios went off. So did the lights. It was a power failure. It was quiet in the garden without the noise. So quiet it was weird. I looked around and an old man near us was slowly picking cucumbers like nothing had happened. Whole city shuts down, but the garden just keeps going, Leona said. She talked on how plants don't run on electricity or clock time, how none of nature did, how nature ran on sunlight and rain and the seasons, and how I was part of that system. The words sort of put me into a daze. My body was part of nature. I was related to bears, to dinosaurs, to plants, to things that were 1,000,000 years old. It hit me that this system was much older and stronger than others. She said how it wasn't some disgrace to be part of it. She said it was an honor. I stared at the squash plants. There was a world in there. It seemed like I could actually see the leaves and flowers growing and changing. I was in that weird daze, and for just that minute, I stopped wishing that my baby would die. This is the last chapter. Nope. 2 more. Amir. In India, we have many vast cities, just as in America. There, too, you are one among millions. But there, at least, you know your neighbors. Here, one cannot say that. The object in America is to avoid contact, to treat all as foes unless they're known to be friends. Here, you have 1 million crabs living in 1 million crevices. When I saw the garden for the first time, so green among the dark brick buildings, I thought back to my parents' Persian rug. It showed climbing vines, rivers and waterfalls, grapes, flower beds, singing birds, everything a desert dweller might dream of. Those rugs were indeed portable gardens. In the summers in Delhi, so very hot, my sisters and I would lie upon it and try to press ourselves into the world. The garden's green was as soothing to the eye as the deep blue of that rug. I'm aware of color. I manage a fabric store. But the garden's greatest benefit, I feel, was not relief to the eye, but to make the eye see our neighbors. I grew eggplants and onions, carrots and cauliflower. When the eggplants appeared in August, they were pale purple, a strange and eerie shade. When my wife would bring our little son, he was forever wanting to pick them. There was nothing else in the garden with that color. Very many people came over to ask about them and to talk to me. I recognized a few from the neighborhood. Not one had spoken to me before, and now, how friendly they turned out to be. The eggplants gave them an excuse for breaking the rules and starting a conversation. How happy they seemed to have found this excuse to let their natural friendliness out. Those conversations tied us together. In the middle of summer, someone dumped a load of tires on the garden at night, as if it were still filled with trash. A man's 4 rows of young corn were crushed. In an hour, we had all the tires by the curb. We were used to helping each other by then. A few weeks later, early in the evening, a woman screamed down the block from the garden. A man with a knife had taken her purse. 3 men from the garden ran after him. I was surprised that I was one of them. Even more surprising, we caught him. Royce held the man to the wall with his pitchfork until the police arrived. I asked the others. Not one of us had ever chased a criminal before, and most likely we wouldn't have except near the garden. There you feel part of a community. I came to the United States in 1980. Cleveland is a city of immigrants. The Poles are especially well known here. I always heard that the Polish men were tough steel workers and that the women cooked lots of cabbage. But I'd never known one until the garden. She was an old woman whose space bordered mine. She had a 7-block wall to the garden, the same route I took. We spoke quite often. We both planted carrots. When her hundreds of seedlings came up in a row, I was very surprised that she did not thin them, pulling out all but one healthy plant for every few inches to give them room to grow. I asked her. She looked down at them and said she knew she ought to do it, but that this task reminded her too closely of her concentration camp, where the prisoners were inspected each morning and divided into 2 lines, the healthy to live, the others to die. Her father, an orchestra violinist, had spoken out against the Germans, which had caused her family's arrest. When I heard her words, I realized how useless was all that I'd heard about Poles, how much richness it hid, like the worthless shell around an almond. I still do not know or care whether she cooks cabbage. The garden found this out with Royce. He was young and black. He looked rather dangerous. People watched him and seemed to be relieved when he left the garden. Then he began spending more time there. We found out that he had a stutter, that he had 2 sisters, and that he liked the cats that roamed the garden, and that he worked very well with his hands. Soon all the mothers were trying to feed him. How very strange it was to watch people who would have crossed the street if they had seen him coming a few weeks before, now giving him vegetables, more than he could eat. In return, he watered for people who were sick and fixed fences and made other repairs. He might weed your garden or use the bricks from the building that was torn down up the block to make you a brick pathway between your rows. He always pretended he hadn't done it. It was always a surprise. Excuse me. One felt honored to be chosen. He was trusted and liked, and famous after his exploits with the pitchfork. He was not a teenage black boy. He was Royce. In September, he and a Mexican man collected many bricks from up the street and built a big barbecue. I was in the garden on Saturday when the Mexican family drove up in a truck with a dead pig in the back. They built a fire, put a heavy metal spit through the pig, and began to roast it. A bit later, their friends began arriving. One brought a guitar, another played violin. They filled a folding table with food. Perhaps it was one of their birthdays, or perhaps no reason was needed for the party. It was beautiful weather, sunny but not hot. Fall was just beginning, and the garden was changing from green to brown. Those of us who'd come to work felt the party's spirit enter us. The smell of the roasting pig drifted out and called to everyone, gardeners or not. Soon the entire garden was filled. It was a harvest festival, like those in India. No one had planned it to be. People brought food and drinks and drums. I went home to get my wife and son. Watermelons from the garden were sliced open. The gardeners proudly showed off what they'd grown. We traded harvests, as we often did, and we gave food away, as we did also. Even I, a businessman trained to give nothing away, to always make a profit. The garden provided many excuses for breaking that particular rule. Many people spoke to me that day, and several asked where I was from. I wondered if they knew as little about Indians as I had known about Poles. One old woman, Italian, I believe, said she'd admire my eggplants for weeks and told me how happy she was to meet me. She praised them and told me how to cook them and asked all about my family. But something bothered me, and then I remembered. A year before, she claimed she received the wrong change in my store. I was called out to the register. She got quite angry and called me, despite her own accent, a dirty foreigner. Now that we were so friendly with each other, I dared to remind her of this. Her eyes became huge. She apologized to me over and over again. She kept saying, "Back then, I didn't know it was you." And friends, this truly is the last chapter, and it's Florence. My great-grandparents walked all the way from Louisiana to Colorado. That was in 1859. They were both freed slaves, and they wanted to get good and far from cotton-growing country. They went over the mountains just to be safe and homesteaded along the Gunnison River, which is how my grandfather and my father and my sisters and I all came to be born there, the first black family in the whole county. My father called them our seed folks because they were the first of our family there. I think of them when I see any of the people who started the garden on Gibb Street. They're seed folks too. I'm talking about that first year before there were spigots and hoses and tool sheds and new soil, and before the landlord started charging more for our apartments that look on the garden. I would have been in the garden for sure if it weren't for this arthritis in my hands. Growing up out in the country, I still miss country things. My husband's from here. He doesn't know about the smell of hayfield and eating beans off the vine instead of from the store. I had to settle for being a watcher. I wasn't the only one. I see others on the fire escapes or standing on the sidewalk like me. One day I looked up and saw a head in the window moving forward and back, and it was a man who pulled up his rocking chair. He was watching the gardeners like TV. My grandmother's sampler from when she was a girl said, "Be not solitary, be not idle." That was easy all those years in the library. Being retired, it's harder. So I try to take a walk every day, which is how I found the garden to begin with. I always stopped there to see something new. I was just a watcher, but I was proud of the garden as if it were mine, proud and protective. I remember how mad I got when I saw a man reach through somebody's fence by the sidewalk and try to grab a tomato. I said, "How dare you?" He pulled his hand back and then said he heard it was a community garden. It's sad every fall seeing it turn brown, fewer and fewer people there. That very first year was the hardest. It had been such a wonderful change to see people making something for themselves instead of waiting for a welfare check, to see part of the neighborhood looking better every day, and to smell those good smells of growing plants. The green drained away, and then the frost hit. You'd pass and hear those dry corn stalks shaking in the wind as if they were shivering. The pumpkins were about the only color left, and then the boy sold them all. Some people cut up their old plants with clippers and dug them back into the soil. A few covered their ground with leaves. But once that job was done, it was done. By November, the cats were the only ones there. That winter was a cold one. Cold as Colorado. You'd walk by the garden covered with snow, just the fence tops sticking out, and you'd try to remember it back in July. Someone stuck a Christmas tree there in December. It stayed up until March. It's hard to tell one month from another that time of year. It's all just winter. Because of the weather, I missed a lot of walks. When I did get out, I couldn't go past the garden without slowing down to look, even though there was nothing growing. Sometimes there'd be one of the gardeners there, just looking too. You'd see Canada across Lake Erie. You can't see Canada across Lake Erie, but you know it's there. It's the same with spring. You have to have faith, especially in Cleveland. Snow in April always breaks your heart. I think we had 2 April snows that year. Waiting for the snow to melt was like waiting for a glacier to move. Finally, it was good, gone for good. The ground was back, and last year's leaves like a bookmark showing where you left off. It was a joy to get out again. Just a walk without wearing a heavy coat and boots felt like flying. But the garden was still empty. I was disappointed. I suppose it was still too early to plant. I began to wonder if anyone would come. Maybe no one was interested. Or maybe the city had shut it down or sold the lot. I was worried. Then one day I passed and someone was digging. It was a little Oriental girl with a trowel and a plastic bag of lima beans. I didn't recognize her. It didn't matter. I felt as happy inside as if I had just seen the first swallow of spring. Then I looked up. There was the man in the rocker, and we waved and waved to each other. What did you think? Did you like that book? I loved that book. I loved our time together. And again, I want to say to you, I'm so proud of all the work you've been doing while you're home. And I miss you. I can't wait till we see each other. But I hope you enjoyed this story. And for now, I'll say goodbye. Take care, friends.